Okay, I think we could start. Hello, everybody. My name is Char Rodriguez. I'm the director of the Family Medicine Education Research Group, and I'm very, very happy to welcome to the first seminar organized by our group this academic year. And I will stop here because the session will be moderated by one of our new master's students in the medical education concentration affiliated with the EFMER, Raymond Tolentino. So Raymond, the Zoom floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. Hello, everyone. My name is Raymond Tolentino. I will be your moderator for today's seminar. I am a master's student in the Department of Family Medicine under the Medical Education concentration. I am currently working on the topics of artificial intelligence and medical education under the supervision of Dr. Samira Rahimi and Dr. Pierre Louis. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge the land that McGill is located on. McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. For today's research seminar, I would like to introduce Dr. Sally Thorne, a professor in the School of Nursing and Associate Dean in the Faculty of Applied Sciences at the University of British Columbia. Today, she will be discussing the use of interpretive description as an approach to qualitative medical education research. Dr. Thorne is the originator of an approach to applied qualitative inquiry that draws on the structure of disciplinary knowledge. In this presentation, she will walk through the elements of design logic, inviting researchers to shape decisions on the basis of their field and clinical wisdom, such that the results of their investigations have credibility and usefulness to the intended audiences. She will explore ways in which this approach to inquiry can help scaffold study designs that best serve the needs of medical education researchers. I would like to note that today's seminar will consist of a 30-minute presentation by Dr. Thorne and 25 minutes for discussion. Questions from the audience can be posted on the chat, or people can raise their hands. The seminar will be recorded. For those who do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your video. And without further ado, Dr. Sally Thorne.
Thank you so much, Raymond and Charo, for that wonderful introduction. And it's delightful to be here today. I realize our time is short, so I'm going to move quickly just to pull up my slides and to make sure I can advance them. There we go. And I too am wanting to acknowledge the Indigenous land that I speak from, the ancestral, traditional, and unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I think we are all evolving in our appreciation of what it means to recognize and take that history forward. My topic today is trying to invite you into critically reflect on your perspective as people who are concerned with medical education research within a unit of family medicine, and to be able to think about how you might take up qualitative methods for the applied questions that you ask in a way that's sensible and exciting and meaningful and actually contributes something to the world. And I'll speak quickly. I've got a lot to say. I'll speak quickly, but I hope there'll be lots of time for questions and discussion. My starting point is the assumption that the foundations of qualitative methods, as we now use them in health research, came directly out of the social sciences. And they were the conventional original designs were all tailor-suited to the nature of the intellectual projects in those social sciences. These are just three of the sort of big granddaddy kind of methods, but they've evolved, of course, over time to many more. And because I'm speaking very briefly, I'm just giving you a thumbnail sketch, certainly not a full explanation of all of these methods, but they will be familiar to anyone who's taken a beginning qualitative research course and tried to learn where this all came from and why it matters. My other starting point is that I fundamentally believe that there is a significant difference between those disciplines that were designed for the purpose of theorizing, and I would consider social sciences to be those disciplines, even though there are people who do applied work in those fields, but the disciplines themselves were designed for the purposes of theorizing. They have a long and honored tradition, require a great deal of in-depth study, and they exist in every university in this country and internationally. So they are a real thing, but they are a quite a different entity than are the applied disciplines. I'm a nurse, you're family physicians, and you may be interdisciplinary. There may be others of you here, but you exist in the world for the purpose of doing something on behalf of society. And that is an incredibly important driver that you cannot erase from your consciousness when you enter a question as a researcher. So although it's overly simplistic, of course, nothing is as much of a binary as that. I'm starting from the assumption methods were designed for one purpose, we use them for a different purpose. And I strongly believe that the major orientation that we need to take into our qualitative designs is not the theories that we read. They may be relevant and interesting and inform us, but we can't erase that disciplinary perspective. I'll show you a little bit about how mine works and invite you to reflect on yours. As family physicians, as medical educators, what that discipline might mean with regard to these questions of how you would take up qualitative research design. You'll notice if you've read any textbooks on qualitative research, disciplinary perspective almost never enters into it. There are many chapters on how you use theory, but we make discipline invisible, and I'm trying to bring it back into visibility. In my discipline, and you may know something about nurses, we always are dealing with wholes and parts. That may be familiar to you as well. We're never simply looking at a patient's left knee, we're looking at the human being that it's attached to it, and we're moving back and forth in our thinking between those wholes and those parts in all of the clinical inquiry, for example, that we might do. And I take it back to clinical inquiry, not that nurses only study clinical problems, we study education problems as well, but that's a fundamental core we can all understand. Another feature that I would say is fundamental to an epistemological lens in nursing is that we are always assuming that the human beings we encounter come with ideas and interpretations. They come from somewhere, they've lived lives, they enter into a clinical encounter full of these ideas and interpretations. It's our business to understand them to the extent that we can, and also to prepare them for the way they will take those ideas and interpretations out into the future. So we're never simply dealing with bodies, we're dealing with human agents that interact with the world of ideas. And probably most importantly, we are always dealing with the knowledge that we need for practice in the form that includes both, always, of commonalities and differences. You shouldn't be qualified for nursing practice if you're only looking for common patterns in what exists. What do most patients experience in this circumstance? The hallmark of excellence in a clinical discipline, I'd argue, is that capacity to not only understand commonalities, but to be more and more excellent over time at being able to detect what might be different about this patient I'm seeing today, this case or this phenomenon, what might be different, and also what I ought to be doing about it, what that might mean in the terms of my clinical work. So the nature of knowledge I would be seeking qualitatively has to deal not simply with commonalities, but also with those differences. So the nature of knowledge, and this will be familiar to any of you in clinical practice, will include both theoretical and empirical knowledge, but enacted in the form of pattern recognition, but never stopping there, moving into the possibility of infinite variation of pattern, and that holding that theoretical ideal of knowing the patient. Not that we ever know ourselves all that perfectly, let alone our patients, but we're always striving toward knowing that person to the best extent that we can. And so it's this kind of configuration toward which we're using qualitative techniques to generate knowledge. And the kind of knowledge we're generating is never the finite knowledge. We're always assuming that the world of healthcare will understand things in a more in-depth and beautiful and rich and fulsome way 5 years from now or 20 years from now. We understand the work we're doing qualitatively to be entering into a conversation in which ideas are evolving over time, and they will evolve over time. And there's probably nothing that we contribute that's an endpoint. We haven't come to the Sally Thorne theory of something, and that's the end of it all. We understand the nature of the knowledge that we're using as infinitely adaptable and flexible and evolving. So our job is to be entering into that conversation to see if we can advance it one step further, not to say, I've reached the final endpoint of something. And so just to illustrate, I won't go into the detail of these slides, but to invite you to reflect on some of the fundamental assumptions that came to us and have stayed in qualitative method even beyond these original three, were very much aligned with assumptions of why these methods were invented in the social sciences in the first place, such as the idea that there are essential nature of lived phenomena, which makes great sense phenomenologically if you're trying to understand something like loneliness, which we could believe occurs across time and space and culture and language. Though it might be something that's essential, that capacity to feel loneliness is essential to being human, but that's very different than the kinds of questions we might be asking in the world of health, including health education, where we're interested in human and contextual variation. So the pieces of methods, such as bracketing the preconceptions, are not relevant when we're trying to build on disciplinary knowledge, not pretend we aren't disciplinary experts asking clinical questions. And this would be similar for both grounded theory and ethnography, in that they have fundamental assumptions about why they're doing what they're doing that make perfect sense methodologically and don't work for us. We, for example, are not very often studying whole cultures. That's not the nature of what we do. We're very interested in culture, but we live in the world in which any individual is not, the representative of a whole culture, but somebody who brings their own lens. They've come from somewhere, they've been here so long, their family has a blend of various traditions. So that just as examples of why those traditions don't work so much. So when we started in qualitative health research, we were confronting quite a lot of resistance in many areas to this as being a real thing. Like, what is this qualitative research? Is it just multiple anecdotes? Are we simply being descriptive? We had to defend this to the health science community, who in the early years when I was beginning as a qualitative researcher, were seeing the only kind of science is quantitative science, and the only relevant questions are those we can frame quantitatively. We were also defending it against to our social science colleagues, for whom they had spent years and years in study to become expert in a thing, and here we are taking a course or two and believing we can do these methods. And of course, trying to explain what we're doing in a way that would be meaningful and reasonable to grant reviewers, journal editors, and that kind of people. So qualitative research entered healthcare in a climate of huge resistance. What is the nature of this thing? Defend why you're doing it. And that explains, I think, in those early years why there was such an emphasis on methodological rigidity. The idea that you would take a method and take it up exactly as it was intended, and you weren't allowed to deviate on that method. Many of you will have learned that in your initial qualitative research courses, to say, don't experiment with method, just follow the textbook for the first time or two. And maybe once you've published a few papers and developed your track record, only then you can make variations. But this methodological rigidity does still explain a lot of what we now continue to consider as things like quality criteria. But the result of this methodological rigidity was a real confusion over the role of theory. A lot of qualitative researchers that would end up making essentializing claims. I've studied 6 of this thing, and I've now got implications that should change the policies of the country. So, grand leaps in logic. Or the opposite, which is abdication of any generalization. And you will have read papers that said, I've interviewed 12 people and my study has no relevance beyond these 12, which would cause you to ask, why bother having done it if it's not going to have any kind of general implication anywhere? So these were some of the problems that we were trying to argue. And some of my early work was pushing back against what is this methodological orthodoxy and why are we doing this? And I wrote a paper with 2 of my graduate students in 1997, because all of my graduate students were asking these questions and pushing back. And at that time used the language of interpretive description for the first time. Thought that was the end of it, but did not realize that this idea of how we would take up who we are from a disciplinary perspective, what it is we think we're doing in the world, what is our purpose, into the world of qualitative methods so that we could really capitalize on them to do good work, to improve the quality of the qualitative enterprise, to be asking the more relevant questions, and to be answering them in ways that actually can advance our thinking. So that was my beginning into the field. And to my great surprise, 25 years later, I still seem to be fascinated with it. So interpretive description, as it's come to be known, I never intended to be an originator of method, but the term was used because it was seen as quite neutral. All qualitative research describes, and in the applied disciplines, we interpret. We're never content with hearing a description of a phenomenon. Our applied mind is always saying, so what? What does that mean to me? What do I do with that information? How might that be useful in my practice? It certainly, from my perspective, came out of a nursing epistemology, but I've come to realize how all of our applied disciplines have their own, and I can't know them all, but invite you to know yours well. In a true nursing tradition, it borrows shamelessly from the best of convention. Whatever will work, we will try and apply to practice. But it borrows technique without necessarily taking along the theoretical baggage that may have come with that technique. So it's using theory as a tool rather than the ultimate purpose of qualitative research. It's drawing on that that applied disciplinary epistemology. It's capitalizing on what I know and bring, what I recognize to be an important question by virtue of my disciplinary expertise. And it's allowing me to be incredibly creative about what data sources might there be, what might make sense, and how might I go about engaging with them and working with them intellectually in order to advance thinking. Much more like clinical detective work than informally following research rules. And another way of saying that is that it's building knowledge translation into the very beginning of any aspect of design. My capacity as somebody in an applied field to know the eventual audience and to understand what is it that audience needs, what kind of knowledge is going to be well suited to advancing that need. And so that idea of knowledge translation as the purpose for research being built into the initial design of everything that we do. And certainly as medical education researchers, there's a very clear outcome and purpose. You can articulate what is it, who is it that needs to know this and for what purpose, and how would we know if it was advancing the knowledge going forward. And that knowledge built into the force structure of your study is incredibly helpful with design. In our world, we're also in the clinical world, we're also organizing this into a wider context. And while yours may not be the evidence-based practice context in the education sphere, always recognizing that there are those external forces explaining what else do we use. We're never operating in the world on the basis of qualitative research findings alone. Those qualitative research findings will be used and taken up within a wider context that we understand by virtue of being in these disciplines. So the kind of work we would call interpretive description is always venturing beyond description and theorizing. It's taking it into the so what. It always assumes there's a force structure. There's never a blank slate and say, nobody knows anything about this. We know a lot about things, and it's that expert knowledge that allows us to say this particular aspect of it, this particular question, this particular element of the challenge needs more study. And so we have an obligation to articulate that and sort of say, how is it that I know that this is the thing to study, and for what purpose am I studying it? So interpretive description is never a prescriptive method. You can't find a textbook that says, do this, do this, do this. It's an invitation to reflect on the options available to you with all aspects of qualitative study design, to be able to make choices that make rational sense in the design logic that connects the reason you ask the research question to the ultimate audience that you want to be speaking to, so that you're not being an interpretive description or necessarily doing interpretive description, but the language can be quite useful if you're finding you're generally using another technique, like you're taking a general grounded theory method, but you're not taking on some of those theoretical traditions that attached to it, you're making modifications. So we often use language like you're using an interpretive description approach, but primarily doing phenomenological style interviewing or something like that. So it can be a very legitimizing mechanism to explain the origins of the techniques without running into the difficulty of being called sloppy methodologically, because you've drawn on a grounded theory analytic technique and been using ethnographic interview design, for example. It can allow you to articulate exactly what you think you're doing in a coherent way. And in particular, it moves us away from framing our research questions in ways that aren't going to be useful. The classic would be, you've all read many, many studies that start with, what is the lived experience of? You know, what is the lived experience about being a medical student, for example, being a learner in the context of a clinical discipline. And the languaging of lived experience is right up front, assuming that there is a common and homogeneous experience and that's the legitimate experience you're trying to study. We understand phenomenologically where that language comes from, but it's highly problematic in qualitative research because it sets you up from the beginning. And it's amazing how many people forget about variations and get themselves totally tunnel visioned on common experience as if there's a singular lived experience, which I'd argue is as problematic in medical education research as it would be in clinical research. So we tend to use alternative forms of posing that central research question that's the driver, such as what can be learned from the accounts or the narratives of a group of medical students about this particular stumbling part in their medical education journey, for example. What can be learned from keeps us grounded to the nature of the question that we're asking, and it certainly allows a lot of creativity along the way to the researcher in making that choice about how to describe, how best to describe what can be learned. What insights are there in this data set? What, from the privilege of being able to gather information, what can I learn and what's going to be relevant to the audience? I've mentioned theory, but I'd like to just say that we don't ignore theory, and a lot of people who do qualitative research will have lots of theoretical ideas in mind, you know, theories of adult learning, whatever they might be. But to recognize that we don't need to take up a singular theoretical framework. And that idea that comes from social science, that you must be working in one conversation and advancing that one conversation, is not useful in our applied fields. We tend to have multiple ones and say, these are the kinds of ideas I'm bringing into this study, such that none of those theories is driving all of the steps of design. It's not predetermining our findings. So for example, the example might be, you might say, instead of saying I'm doing a critical feminist study to study something, you might say critical feminist theory is one of the ideas that I might be taking into this. And that's very different proposition. It doesn't presume that necessarily the only interesting answer you're going to come up with is power imbalance and justify them on the basis of gender. So it allows you to move in and out of, is this theoretical perspective helping me? Is it causing me to see things differently? And often multiple theories, if you choose to use them beyond disciplinary perspective, is going to be helpful, because every single theory will privilege certain kinds of ideas and
if you can give me this.
And obscure other ideas. I'm going to talk talk quickly for just a few more minutes. It's an invitation as well to consider what are the multiple data sources, and this list would be in relation to clinical work, but thinking about my discipline does way too many individual interview studies because we never have enough time to talk to patients, I'm sure. But to be able to think not just of, is this a focus group study? Is this a documentary analysis? But what are the multiple ways of things? What are the various ways we might look at something? And can we build them all into study design? Can we look at multiple angles of things? And one part that we can also include in our studies is expert opinion. In medical education, I'm very sure that there are expert educators among you, and the study of those experts and the drawing on their wisdom in the context of our studies can sometimes be a very useful adjunct to studying learners or studying problems. Sample size in qualitative research is always a problem, and it's a problem because we live in a world that requires that any proposal we create for our master's thesis or our doctoral dissertation or our funded research always needs to be built on estimates of how many. We can't get ethical approval for research without how many. But always remember that it's artificial. And just like clinical detective work, we sometimes need to examine more before we think we have anything to say. There will never be anything magical about sample size. And if you think back to the commonalities and differences argument that I made, we will never get to the point that we will say, I have studied enough that I can guarantee that there's no more variation within the data. That redundancy idea or saturation idea is never really relevant to these kinds of human worlds that we do. All of us would accept that even the most experienced, skilled educator over time will run into one more student that has one more variation on a problem, one new challenge. It's a never-ending kind of enterprise. So we do need to function in the world of finishing our study, publishing our research, but trying not to make the mistake of claiming that I've saturated, I've got to the end point, there's nothing more to be said. Think about, this is a new insight that I can add for now, and I'm welcoming the ongoing conversation. The work of data analysis is obviously the most complex part of any qualitative study, and it is essentially that invitation to take the pieces of things that you've gathered and move them into patterns, to be able to look at relationships within data and to be able to say, what am I seeing here? What's interesting? And to document that analytic thinking along the way, because as the insights start to surface, you never know which of them will turn out to be relevant to you. So I'm a great fan of the personal field notes of what's going on in my analytic mind. Interpretive description invites you beyond recipes. It's not simply a matter of coding. Coding is filling in those predetermined theoretical categories that you started with, or assuming that grouping the thing is the only thing. Grouping and taxonomies and categories and subcategories are simply some of the techniques and homework you're doing as you look at something in different ways to ask yourself the fundamental question, what is there in my data set that might be relevant to the audience I'm trying to speak, that might help answer that research question and create some useful insights for my field. And often we begin that analytic engagement by saying, what did we find that we already expected to find? That's not findings. That's simply, yep, the literature told me that this is what the field looks like. And we did find that as expected. And when you move beyond what did I find as expected, and then move into what story is emerging, what was unexpected, what are things that I hadn't quite thought I'd see in the way that I saw it, and what might that mean? And how are they similar and different across cases? The reporting of qualitative research is then what story is emerging from these accounts. And not just any story, but what's the story that needs telling? What is it that's going to actually meet the knowledge needs of my intended audience? So that the writing up of findings then isn't ever just an itemized collection. I found 16 categories and 45 sub-themes of something, but you're trying to build that into a coherent narrative, to build an account that will allow your reader to follow your logic, to follow the logic of the account that you can create now that's going to lead them toward a different insight or a higher level insight or a more comprehensive insight, or combine two ideas together that hadn't been combined previously. So you've got a storyline or a narrative that you will use to organize that reporting of your findings. And so through all of this, you're really thinking about this knowledge translation integration, thinking about that intended audience. Who are the people that might listen to or read this report? What are their knowledge needs? And how can I frame my study? How can I frame the report of my study in such a way that I'm not simply telling them things, but I'm leading them toward a new insight that's grounded deeply in the work that I did in data collection and interpretation of data. So the explicit contribution of this kind of research in the applied field, I think, can really be those things that science misses or misunderstands. Obviously, those things that defy quantification, the things that behave in ways that can't be regularized, and that which changes outside the context of its natural complexity. I'm very sure there's a great deal in medical education that you would recognize in that space. And qualitative research in this way can really help be a corrective to big science, the things we know on the basis of large quantitative studies, population-based studies, that sort of thing. It can be a gap filler, and strategically knowing the literature and knowing where there's a gap. You know, we might know that something works really well in medical education 85% of the time, but what happens to those other 15%? What do they look like, and what's the nature of their needs? So pointing us toward what are the things we don't know, what are the gaps between what we have studied in other ways. It can also always be an illuminator. And certainly in human health experience, we fully understand why shining a light on something so that people can understand it in an experiential way would be very important. And I know that the process of turning a human being that walks in off the street into a physician is very much an engaged and complex human experience. What's that like? And how can we convey that learning experience and certain challenges in the learning experience through to a teaching community? Always an important part of this kind of work is that it can help us interpret variance. And this is so important in the world of equity, diversity, and inclusion in healthcare education. How do we spot the things that will be relevant differences in the learning journey? How do we spot them? How do we figure out what they are? How do we work with them? And this kind of research can be extremely helpful. Never to the idea of saying, I'm going to name every single diversity that could ever occur in my learner population, for example, but I'm going to guide educators to be able to think about that challenge of diversity, how one takes it into account in thinking, and how one builds programs that can speak to that. Just as family physicians would always be thinking about, how can I spot and manage those diversities that might walk into my office at any point over time. It can also be a challenger. What are the dominant fixed assumptions in the discipline, and how can I point my qualitative inquiry in a direction that tries to pull them apart a little bit, unpack them a little bit, suggest that maybe there's a thing to be thought of a bit more critically. And finally, of course, qualitative research is always a powerful tool for humanizing phenomena. And because of all of this, in spite of the fact that I thought 25 years ago I'd published one paper and that was the end of it, I'm finding that the discussion still continues, because this question of how we own what we are in our applied disciplines and how we construct really great qualitative studies, even if they're small studies, even if they're my very first study that I've ever done in life, but how can we take over those designs away from the textbooks, bring them into our discipline, and design and create studies that are really going to meet our knowledge needs. And I'll pull off the slides now. These are just a few of the resources that might be useful to you, but I'd love to see if there are questions and comments and challenges.
Thank you, Dr. Thorne. Again, we have the questions can be raised or it can be on the chat. So going first.
I see Justin's hand.
Justin.
Hi there. I'm Justin Sanders. I'm the new chair of palliative care here at McGill University. So it's so nice to meet you. I know there's some overlap in our work.
Yes.
I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that a lot, and it resonated so much with some of my own thinking about qualitative research. So thank you for that. You put into words a lot of things that I feel. One of the things I was curious about is in thinking about rigor in qualitative research, I think about sort of the mitigation of bias as one of the most important things. And I've always sort of taught my mentees that theory, or more importantly, even theorizing, which I think builds on our own experiences, is the thing that keeps us honest in our qualitative research, meaning that we don't just find what we thought we were going to find, because we're transparent about that. And I'm curious about your thoughts about reflexivity in this approach, because anthropologists have used reflexivity well, they've both used it well and been paralyzed by it at times, right? And so I'm curious sort of how you think about acknowledging our place when, at what points we sort of engage with where we're coming from a critical standpoint as it relates to our approach and our findings.
Oh, thank you so much. There's so many layers in that question, Justin. Thanks so much for asking it. And I think a point I'd like to emphasize, in case it wasn't clear, is I certainly didn't invent this idea of trying to work with method. When we wrote that 1997 paper, it was based on observations of what they were doing when good applied people were manipulating methods to answer their questions. So it was based on a kind of qualitative observation of the qualities of the kind of research that actually got to answering questions rather than filling in gaps. And I think you're pointing to those real tensions between the traditions and sometimes the need, and the conviction in the social sciences that it is, if you stick to theory as your grounding point, then you won't get into trouble with that internal bias that we might have as researchers. And I think they're primarily thinking of it as human researchers rather than disciplinary researchers. If you think of studying any human phenomena, we can't divorce that from our humanness as a researcher. We can't step out of being human and be some kind of a robot studying human culture, for example. We all have lives, we all have emotions. And so I think the importance of creating that sharp division was very strong. In our context, though, what it's done is just strip off the relevance of that disciplinary lens. And I think that disciplinary lens actually carries us as strongly as the theoretical lens was intended to in much of that research. So I'm trying to kind of build it back in. That said, though, I'd absolutely agree with you that without reflexivity, we can just recreate the same knowledge. That, I as a nurse can continue to see the kinds of things that nurses see and not see what a social worker would see or an occupational therapist or a family physician would see. So reflexivity will continue to be incredibly important. But I don't hold with the same kinds of arguments about rigor, that rigor requires the pulling all of that possible bias out. What I would do instead is to engage with that and to try and say, what biases have come from my disciplinary perspective and what sense can I make of them? And ideally, if we had more than the 15 manuscript pages to write our papers, we would be able to insert quite a lot of that into the writing, so that the reader, this is the informed disciplinary reader, can see that logic along the way and can understand how you came to that. It's a very interesting problem, but I think that the conventional ideas, like trustworthiness, we've all used that as language in talking about rigor, but often, that ends up being, does this fit? Does this fit with what everybody else has studied in the thing, which may or may not have anything to do with quality. And quality may be, does this actually open it up in a new way? Have I paid attention to where the knowledge came from, for sure, but have I opened it up in a new way? And have I explained that in a way that somebody who understands that field well can go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite that way, and can come into it with critical analysis as well. So it's an ongoing, interesting conversation about which I'm not all that comfortable with fixed rules. I'm certainly very comfortable with exposed logic.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have our next question with Kate.
Hi, Kate.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Sally, for your talk. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine, and my PhD is in anthropology. So first of all, I wanted to commend you on what you had to say about framing and saturation. I am constantly trying to convey that to the students in my courses, and I think you did that more beautifully than I have been able to. I was a bit taken aback by the claim, though, that the social sciences it almost sounds like you're saying that they're putting the theory as the wagon before the horse. And in my experience, I've actually found that most of the anthropologists I know do a better job of what you're trying to suggest that applied qualitative health researchers should be doing than most most applied qualitative research, health researchers that I know. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you feel that theory should be used, I guess, and whether I'm misunderstanding this claim that like social science puts the wagon before the horse.
No, you're pointing out something that comes from abbreviating a conversation. That instead of talking to you for 8 hours about this phenomenon, I got half an hour, and so I was trying to very much abbreviate what are also complex conversations, and that sharp distinction between theorizing the social sciences and action and the applied disciplines is quite problematic. Even way back, part of my PhD was also in anthropology, and at that point there was the Suits and the Birkenstocks in the anthropology meetings, two species of people, and they didn't like each other much either. So the diversity, there have been applied people doing work in the social sciences for a long time, and they may very well have taken that further than people in the health field. So I think I really appreciate that. I think that the point, sort of the motivation here is that we're using qualitative techniques which have some power, and we've made some kind of silly mistakes that we still make. And I'd argue that we absolutely still do. If you look at the quality criteria that are listed when you try and publish qualitative research, some of the tick boxes are remnants. Have you reached theoretical saturation, for example? Many of those are remnants of that thing that I'm overgeneralizing, but I'm just taking it as my starting point. And they're not necessary, they have nothing to do with quality. So have I mentioned the word saturation in my qualitative research report has absolutely nothing to do with the rigor and quality of the findings. And yet that will be the kind of tick box. Anybody who's tried to publish will know that some reviewer will say, you didn't mention, which is about as silly as saying that because I didn't give you the credential number of my ethics review certificate that my study is unethical. So we have lots and lots of artifacts and remnants of that history. I think that saturation is one that just drives me crazy because it doesn't work particularly well in an applied discipline, whether you're talking about theoretical or data or any other kind. But the notion that Kirsti Malterud and her group in Norway created on information power is, I think, one of the better ones, and many people find that that's just a much more useful way to be able to say it. And said simply is, have I studied this enough to have something useful to say? I'm certainly not claiming I got the final answer or that there's no more to study. We're all in applied disciplines. We're going to be studying these things for the rest of our lives. But we live in a world that's artificially parceled and pieced out in the next grant application, the next thesis, the next publishable piece. The pieces are not the reality. The pieces are the artificial social structure within which we're living lives that continue to ask questions that drive us and move on to the next question. So have I done enough research here to have something useful to say is a far better way to be able to think about, can I finish data collection and end? But there will be no magic bell that rings and says, you've hit the end point. There's no more point in thinking about it. All of our qualitative studies are works in process.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but thanks. I totally take your point that I'm overgeneralizing, and I'm trying to do it to kind of make a point so that people can critically reflect on these rules didn't just appear. These rules that sometimes don't make sense. When you have to check out the COREC, and did you do member checking, for example? Some studies, it's a good idea to go back to the people you interviewed and say, here's your transcript, did you actually say this? And other studies, that's a hollow and ridiculous and not terribly useful exercise. So somehow the idea of member checking as being consistent with quality gets into those tools, even though it's a reflection of some kinds of research and not others.
It's also very strange to assume that a study participant who may be coming from a very different place than you would necessarily have the same interpretation of their own experience that you would, and that doesn't mean that your interpretation is valueless by any means.
Absolutely. And the other thing that's been observed, of course, is that the step of member check, which seems like a good idea superficially on surface, can lead researchers into creating interpretations that reflect the more favorable light on whoever they're studying. That don't point out any of the complexity, sort of, don't mention any of the unsavory parts or something like that. Make everybody into being a hero, for example, instead of reflecting that complexity. And so I think that there's some very useful, critical reasons not to uncritically take up these steps that come in textbook, but rather to say, for my study, would this be useful? If I'm studying medical students and what they're going through, are these ideas the kinds of ideas that I might want to take back to them? And would I do it by handing them a transcript and say, is this what you actually said? Or would I gather a group of them together and say, these are the things we think we're finding. Does this resonate with you? What else are we missing? So, that might be the more intelligent step to build in, rather than I handed them the transcripts and they corrected them for any errors. So I use that just as a sort of a superficial example of how we uncritically take up some of these methodological guidelines. And further, I think that particularly newer researchers who are working in a field in which they know something and are committed to something very often get partway into a study and they realize that thing I thought I would do, now that I'm here and I've done some interviews, taking transcripts back to the people and saying, did you really say this, is not going to provide anything. What else should I be doing? What other kinds of credibility steps could I be building in at this point? And in an ideal world, an interpretive description would sort of look to an ideal world in which I could partway through a study say, no, that step didn't actually make sense. I'm going to modify it because this is going to be the better way. I'm going to gather a group of clinicians around or senior educators to say, this is what we think we're seeing, but you've seen many and thousands. Have we caught it all? Is there something we're missing? Well, there's some great examples coming up in the chat. Thank you. Other comments or questions? It can be quite daunting to encourage people, because especially those that are just learning methodology, you expect to be taught a bunch of rules and then to just take them up and try and put them into practice, and to say, well, actually, we're also expecting you to think for yourself and say, this next step, does it actually make sense? Is this, what do you expect to get from this? And what I believe is that it's actually much easier for a thoughtful, intelligent person, such as I'm assuming your community would contain. It's much easier to invite people to say, well, what's the rational basis for doing it this way? Why would you do it this way? An example that we run into clinically would be that for a psychologist, for example, you would always design a study that you're either talking to patients or patients and their partners, dyads, but you wouldn't design a study in which you'd say they can come in by themselves or with their partner, doesn't matter. And yet in the clinical world, that's how we would operate clinically. And so to be able to take design decision and say, no, that's not a quality measure. That's a decision that we can reason out and we can reflect on. What are the implications of having made that design choice? What does it mean to my findings that some of these people talked about themselves and some of them talked about their experience with the caregiver present. I've been studying medical assistance in dying lately, and those, we all can imagine that people who are thinking about end-of-life decisions might talk differently about that with their loved one in the same room or not. But that's not a problem methodologically, because of the comfort we have in the clinical world and our capacity to be able to critically reflect on what might not have been said because so-and-so was in the room, for example.
There are some great papers on the chat, but we have another question by Justin.
Thanks. I just actually want to elevate Anne Cockcroft's question, because I think it's such a good one about how we, she wrote that unfortunately many reviewers are not up to date with these ideas. And I think that it makes me think sort of about the philosophy of science and how we recreate knowledge by citing knowledge and, or citing other things, and that sort of builds on itself. How do you approach this idea when you encounter unfamiliarity among reviewers with what you're talking about in a way that you can sort of defended and legitimate.
Well, I can see it's getting better over time. But part of the reason we wrote the paper on interpretive description, and at that time, historically, the journal we published it in was one of the most credible in nursing. And that, we worked hard to get it into a credible journal exactly for that reason, so that people could cite it. And it turns out to be the case that people can more comfortably argue and say, well, I respectfully see what the reviewer is talking about, but according to this, I'm using this, and according to this is an appropriate decision. So that's partly why I kept writing, because my awareness that people genuinely do need a reference point to be able to justify some of those arguments. You don't get into a spitting match with a reviewer. Often, if people call their study interpretive description, it does not mean that they've done it in any certain way, because there's nothing prescriptive about the method, but it releases them of the obligations that come. If you say, I'm doing this phenomenological study, the reviewer can legitimately expect that you will have followed certain rules. And so that's the challenge. This is freeing you up. And there's nothing that makes your reports bulletproof. I do think that the more logically represented they are, the more defensible they tend to be with reviewers. But I had a paper just a couple of years ago that got turned back and rejected by a qualitative research journal, saying interpretive description isn't a method; it's nothing more than grounded theory. So there's nothing that can protect you fully. But I think that the numbers of papers that have been published using interpretive description over time now make it quite clear that it has become a legitimizing argument. And while they might have sort of common features, they're not all the same. They would be studies that have used that researcher logic coming from their applied perspective into trying to present a coherent argument. As Justin says, nothing can protect you from reviewer number 2. Absolutely the case. But those are just some thoughts. I think that by being able to articulate, I'm doing a sort of participatory action kind of study, but I'm modifying the convention using interpretive description. That kind of language allows you to signal to the researcher that or to the reviewer, if they're making an assumption methodologically based on a certain tradition, that doesn't legitimately apply. It should be the case that you could just write and say, I'm a smart person and I decided that this is a good way to go about it. But we all know that's not the world we live in, and we need to have the authorities that confirm that. And speaking of authorities, I see Matthew Hunt there.
Hello, Sally. Well, I just want to thank you very much for the talk today, but also I'm really appreciative of all your work, because I've learned a great deal from it and used it in different ways, and now working with students and teaching students using interpretive description. So really grateful for all of that. I have 2 questions, one really a curiosity one, and I'll save that for the second. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about the analysis process. You've talked about some really interesting things. I remember in the slide, there was the distinction between seeing the pattern, seeing the pattern and seeing the relationships. And for students, often, we code, we label, we're at the pattern level. And then that challenge of like knocking the electron into the next level when it comes towards interpretation, and that idea of the story that needs to be told. I'd be interested to hear any more thoughts that you have, maybe especially in relation to mentoring students using the method. And then my second little curiosity thing, on your book, and you showed us the cover of it, you selected the Escher print of the staircases so can you tell us why you chose that and why that represents interpretive description for you in some way?
Well, the last one, I think it's more the odyssey of the ongoing. There's no end to the whole thing. I mean, that's perhaps that's over-simplistic, but it's there's nothing linear about a qualitative study, and there's nothing linear about the intellectual journey of a scholar in a field. Whether it's a clinical scholar, whether it's a educational scholar, we're always continuing. That's the curiosities that drive us are taking us on all these diverse directions over time. I love the question about analysis, because so much of the analysis literature, as you know, and so many of the workshops you might go to and that kind of thing are really very much focused on coding and organizing and sorting and taxonomizing. And those traditions make tremendous sense if you're starting with a theoretical framework and it's got 4 parts of a thing and you organize yourself into the 4 parts. But you can get yourself so caught in doing that that you can't possibly see anything else. And so I've become not a fan of coding. I encourage my own students to sort of stick away from it and go with marginal notes and reflections and other things. Like, certainly know your data set, but suspend coding for quite some time until coding becomes something that becomes more useful when you really have a legitimate basis for understanding the groupings or the buckets of things that you want to do, and that they in themselves are not analysis. They're just the organizing. You know, it's like putting your laundry in the different colored groups so that you can wash it and not make any mistakes. But it doesn't mean that that's how you're to wear it. It's just part of the process of moving forward. And I do realize that in to use language like narrative and story makes it sound a little bit artificial, and that it's not a legitimate logical account. But but by pulling it into that language and saying you are a writer, you're a thinker and a writer, and you have an opportunity here to begin somewhere and end it somewhere. We all know how to do this in a literature review. I don't think any of us take the old-fashioned kind in which you just line up every study and say, this, Hunt published this, and this is what's wrong with it. So-and-so published this, and that's what's wrong. That kind of technique of literature review is no longer acceptable. We require people to say, what are the main things that you want to organize? What are the ideas? How would you build them in a logical sequence that ends up at this is the study that needs to be done? So that same kind of inductive reasoning process that does point you toward what possibly is here. And for writing a qualitative report, I would always encourage students to move beyond the first one they come up with. Say, okay, that's an interesting, plausible line of reasoning to present your findings. Put that aside for a while, come up with another one, and then defend to me why this one is better than this one. And if you can come up with 2 or 3 possible lines of reasoning, it allows you to really own the one that you ultimately end up with, and you understand its logic and where it's taking someone. And I think that process, much more than the coding enterprise, can help you create really rich and interesting and meaningful qualitative findings.
Thank you, Sally.
We have our last question because of time. Taro?
Yes, thank you. So thank you very much. Sally, has been a terrific presentation. I really like it. And there are many points that I would have liked to discuss further with you, but there is one that I think that you have spoke about at the beginning. And I would invite you to develop a little bit more, is how to link the use of the different methodologies that emerge in other disciplines in our own applied discipline. I think that for nursing, for family medicine, that is very difficult to give shape of the field of inquiry for these different disciplines. This is a major point. And I think you have applied to qualitative research, but it should be applicable to any other type of research approach. So this link between methodology and the discipline. So yes. Yeah.
I really appreciate that question. I think that's why I really do see discipline as the driver, because I'm not existing in the world to do studies. There's things about who I am and what I do in the world that drive me into curiosities. And so my challenge should always be, which are the methods that are going to get me there. And to simplify the argument, I focused on those 3 early methods and the large ones. But if you think about something like photo voice, instead of saying I'm going to be a photo voice researcher and sort of immerse in it totally and do that research, a thoughtful person might say, I'm studying adolescents, some aspect of their healthcare, but what might happen if I got them to take a few pictures and reflect on that and integrate that into my study? So, can I interview them and also say, let me know what your social world looks like or your home life looks like. So I think that many times, if you're just driven by that curiosity that comes from who you are and why you're doing research, that the technique that you can find across the huge range of evolving methods, and there are so many, and it's such a rich tradition now, can be incredibly helpful. And I don't think you need to commit to them 100%. Example being participatory research. The philosophy of participatory community-based research is wonderful, but if you're a doctoral student and a master's student, are you really prepared to hand over your entire project to a community that might in the end say, no, we don't think we want this published, thank you, let's just stop. You're not likely to do that, but can you take some of the philosophy of a community participatory approach into the way in which you're engaging with research? And I think we're all intelligent people. These are things that we can engage with, and if we mix and match things that don't look like they're typically mixed and matched, it's then our obligation to explain and describe why we're doing it, what we think the impact will be, what impact will it have on the nature of the data we're getting, and certainly any limitations that we might have come up with regard to how it might have influenced the conclusions that we can come up with. But I do think that unfortunately, some of the qualitative tradition in trying to do what it did to reduce the human implicit bias also caused us to be very hesitant about using our brains in research. And I think our brains and our curiosities, are what drives them and what can lead to those really gorgeous research projects.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Sally, for joining us today and sharing your work. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our seminar, and there's great literature in the chat as well, if anybody who's interested. So again, thank you so much. If you'd like to catch our next seminar, the Family Medicine Graduate Program and the Family Medicine Education Group will be hosting our next seminar on December 3rd with guest speaker Francesca Lucconi. Thank you so much for everybody for coming, and thank you again, Sally.
Thank you so much for having me.